From Canadian Food Focus, this is Ask a Farmer. I'm your host, Clinton Monchuk, a Saskatchewan farmer. In this podcast, we talk to food experts to answer your questions about your food. So with us today on the podcast, we have Timothy Caulfield. Timothy is a professor at the University of Alberta, along with many different hats. We're going to be talking a little bit about why people have some fear around their food. But before we get into that, I think everybody wants to know a little bit about you. I'm pretty sure majority have already heard your name, but just give us a little bit of overview of who you are and some of the work you do as an author, as a professor, and a personality on Netflix too.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy at the University of Alberta, and to be honest with you, I really think of myself as a interdisciplinary researcher. I know I'm in the law faculty and in with the School of Public Health, but I really do think of myself as an interdisciplinary researcher, and I look at science and health policy. My real passion is, how is science represented in the public sphere? What kind of evidence do we use to make decisions, make health policy decisions about our food, decisions about, what kinds of therapies we want to use. So we bring a bunch of different methods to bear on those broad questions. And I've also been really lucky to get very really involved with the media and writing for the popular press and doing books for the general public, which is, speaking of my passions,
Yeah,
that's my real
yeah.
passion. I absolutely love writing, and I've also been involved in a number of documentary projects. So I love coming at this topic from every direction, and I love engaging with the public.
And this is why you're such an excellent person to have on the program. We know that there's a ton of information out there, right? When it comes to food and just science in general. But why is it that we're living in a era right now where we have all these different new technologies that are out there? The science is just being produced in masses. We're knowing more about our food or our health, and yet people are lacking the trust around that. And why do you think there's a general lack of trust? And obviously this program's more about food, but we can see it in a whole different array of categories as well. And why is it that we're living right now with this lack of trust?
It is a remarkable time, isn't it? And so many paradoxes which you've touched on. We've never had as much information as we have right now about food, about health, about our environment. And we've never had such a great distribution of the good science. We always talk about the misinformation and the bunk, but people still have access now like never before. I can remember being an undergrad, right? Having to go to the stacks to find science. People have access to that stuff now. And
Right.
despite that, we're seeing this profound confusion. We're seeing this profound polarization. We are seeing this decrease in trust. And I think it's important to recognize, big caveat there, that people still trust scientists. They still trust scientific institutions. They still trust farmers.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that trust has come down, and in some jurisdictions like the United States, it's really come down. It's really come down. I think a bunch of things are going on. Obviously, fantastically complex, social, cultural phenomenon. But all the listeners could probably guess this, right? I used to say different things, but now I think the two big things are the social media and the degree to which this is about ideology. And the third thing I'm going to put on there is the role of prominent individuals. It used to be celebrities, but now you have a whole bunch of influencers that are really directing public discourse, and not always in a science-based way. So you have that kind of and all those three things work together: social media, ideology, the role of prominent voices create this polarized, often ill-informed um, information environment that just doesn't help anyone.
So do you feel that sometimes the science, as we learn more about the science, that it's confusing? And I think you talked about it. The social media just amplifies it, right? But is there, science that will go one way and another way depending on new research that kind of makes people waver a little bit? And does that create some level of lack of trust?
So the answer is yes. Not going to surprise you. Not going to
Yeah.
surprise you. And
Yeah.
there's actually really interesting research on this that you might not be, not may not be aware of. So they've actually studied that when the public sees conflicting recommendations, their trust goes down, and the likelihood that they're going to believe and act on it goes down also. Big caveat, hard to study that well, of course,
Right.
but there is at least some evidence that supports that, and I think it's also intuitively it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That happens, and I think that there are a bunch of lessons to take from that. First of all, I think we need to be more transparent about how science is uncertain and it does evolve, and the recommendations are going to be evolve. I think we also need to point to the reality how we talk about this stuff in the public sphere. Headlines that say eggs kill you, is not great. It's not
Right.
great, and or we saw it with coffee too. Like I'm a big
Yeah.
coffee fan, right?
Yeah.
You see that back and forth with coffee. You see it with back and forth with alcohol and wine. And it is confusing, and it causes the public to kind of shut down a little bit, right? To say, "Oh, I'm
Mhm.
just not gonna listen to that." And the other element here, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, is we got to be careful not to overinterpret the studies that inform those conclusions, right? Because often those are observational studies, they're cohort studies, this not causation studies that are leading to those really often dramatic conclusions. There's some really interesting research that talks about how the media loves those observational studies. And again, it's important to recognize observational studies can be valuable, but they don't give you robust causation results, right?
Right. Yeah.
But the media loves them, right? Because they are often about chocolate and coffee and sex and things like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they're headline grabbing conclusions. So I think that's the other lesson we can take from that back and forth that comes with it. And one of the things I always say, you're gonna maybe get sick of me saying that on this podcast. You also want to remember to go back to that body of evidence, right?
Right.
The research is going to go back and forth on a particular topic, but always take a step back and say, okay, what does the body of evidence say on this topic? And the body of evidence with food, we know what a healthy diet looks like.
Yeah.
We've known it for a long time. The cliches are true, right? Moderation, healthy grains, fruits and vegetables, healthy proteins. There's really no magic.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. So you mentioned a little bit too on the causation versus correlation. Right? Granted, they're trying to make you like look at something totally outrageous, right? To say that correlation does not mean causation. But how many people really look into that science? Like I feel like we've become a lazy society, right?
Let's be kinder to society and say that it's a chaotic information environment, and it's more
Yeah.
difficult, and people are aren't really invited to reflect, right? It's this
Yeah.
frantic information environment where they get headlines on their phone, right? And so you're right. People don't go, okay, wait a second, what kind of evidence is that? Is that just an anecdote? Is that
Hmm.
just a testimonial? Is that just an observational study? People don't do that. And as you know, and I want to be careful, some people do that, but as you know, people read the headline and maybe they read the first paragraph and they don't go to the 11th paragraph that says, this was an observational study, cause it, if that quote is even there. Sometimes it isn't there. And the other interesting thing with food, and this is something I've actually wanted to study. We've studied this in other domains with food. Often it's an article that is in a lifestyle magazine, or maybe it's in an entertainment magazine, or maybe it's a sports star talking about their diet. So there really isn't that space to do a scientific uh, analysis, right?
Yeah.
And we've done it in the context of stem cells. We've looked at that. I call it implicit hype, right? It's not really a a media venue where you're going to get that kind of more thoughtful scientific analysis. But this reminds me of one of the tools that we all want to implement that I often talk about is this idea of pausing and reflecting on what's really in that content. And if you just invite people to do that just for a moment, you can make a
Mhm.
real difference.
Yeah, and I know reading your book, the Tom Brady factor, right? So
Yeah.
every time he went to a Super Bowl, I'd hear about his diet over and over again, and for whatever reason, I think maybe if I had adopted his diet, I'd be built like him. I think we've witnessed over time some of how people look to these quick fixes to heal their ailments or bring about some superior health in their own bodies. How has this manifested itself in food over time, and kind of why are some of the reasons that it's taken place?
Hey, you're so right. There's so much to unpack in that question, and you're spot on. I think, first of all, so often it is that anecdote, right? It is that testimonial from a celebrity that can generate a lot of the traffic, can generate the momentum around a topic, right? And we know good empirical evidence to back this up that an anecdote, a testimonial, can overwhelm our ability to think scientifically. Humans are, some people have suggested we're hardwired to respond to those stories. So when Tom Brady talks about his diet, first of all, that's a celebrity, right? It's a bigger megaphone, a good looking celebrity, right? So you're going to remember it, that plays to our availability bias.
Right.
And it's a narrative. It's this story. It worked for him. I'll have like thoughtful academic colleagues that will say, well, it works for Tom Brady. How can you argue with that? Well, you can argue with that. It's an anecdote. It's a
Right.
testimonial. It's
Yeah.
not it's not science, right? So you have that whole aspect going on. Um, and then you can see, people will often still say to me, I don't believe celebrities have that much of an impact. Look at the gluten-free trend. And I think, I'm obsessed with this trend. I'm absolutely I followed it from the very beginning. And it was created by celebrities, right? It was, Miley Cyrus, Gwyneth Paltrow, other athletes have adopted it, sports, and they talk about it, right? And that gluten-free trend still exists. I know it's not the sexy diet now, it's not the hot button diet, but it still exists, and, there's no evidence to support the idea that it's inherently healthier. Yes, if you're celiac, yes, if you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and there's some other health conditions where we're getting emerging evidence it might be beneficial, but that's not how it's marketed. It's marketed as if it's inherently healthier and you're gonna lose weight. No evidence to support either one of those things. And it's really built on the back of it. This entire industry built on the back of what really was a pop culture representation of this area. Then layer on top of that the last thing that you said, right, around this desire for a quick fix, a desire for a simple answer. I've been studying diets and following diets for decades. Has there ever been ever a trendy new diet that actually worked, right? Long term. Every diet works short term, right? Everyone loses weight for a little while.
Yeah.
Name one that has worked, sustained weight loss for, long none of them. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
there are individuals out there and say, "Oh, this worked for me," but on a population level, the answer is no, right? And still, still we see every 18 months, every 2 years, there's a new trendy diet, right? And it's just phenomenal. What does it say about human nature, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you can go even further. And I know you like to talk about Gwyneth Paltrow, and I think she's an absolutely excellent actress. But obviously, when she's talking about some of the different health trends or some of the different things, like she's got a vested interest in some of these things that she's trying to market, and I don't understand why people don't see through some of that. Right? Like it's a product that you're trying to market. You put these names like a superfood, right? Or this is going to cleanse you from this or that, but there's no backing for it, right? But yet it takes off. And it's just interesting to watch some of that, and just how that creates almost their own businesses, right?
It is fascinating, and you raise a very interesting paradox that is out there in the universe, and this is the idea of conflict of interest. So a lot of people will say that they are drawn to people like, well, alternative medicine and Gwyneth Paltrow and alternative ways of eating because they can't trust big food. They can't trust big pharma. There are all these conflicts of interest at play, but they ignore the conflicts of interest that are embedded, that are inherent in
Yeah.
the other individuals that are the alternate perspectives.
Right.
They pick their conflict of interest that they're going to be uh, upset about. Yes, big food. I hate that phrase. Big pharma. I hate that. But there are problems there, right? But one could argue the conflicts of interest are even more profound with these other actors because, but for the selling of these products, their industry wouldn't exist, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, Gwyneth Paltrow, she recently was talking about how she has long COVID, and that she disses conventional medicine, and then she starts talking about all these modalities that she's using, and then right underneath her post are she's selling these products. She's selling,
Yeah.
supplements. She's selling, essential oils. It's a profound conflict of interest that is often ignored by those who are attracted to those modalities.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of brings us close to our midpoint. The farm fact is from a survey done by the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. So this survey was taken in 2022 and surveyed just shy of 3,000 Canadians. And within the survey, it actually said that 97% of Canadians were either moderately or very trustworthy of labels placed on food packaging. On one hand is good, right? Because there's a lot of good
Yeah.
information from ingredients to the different calories, protein, fat, like all that sort of stuff. But it does bring a little bit of an issue when we start talking, and again, you mentioned in your book things like GMO free water or gluten free water, right? And how does that kind of play out on the labeling side? Like, do you feel that some of that just opens up because to be fair, the CFIA can't go out and monitor every single package, right, to make sure that they're 100% truthful or not misleading. And it's really upon us to send in those requests to say, okay, this is bogus, right? This isn't true. Um, but what do you think about that? What do you think about the trust that actually exists for labels with Canadians?
I'm surprised it's that high. First of all, that's really
Yeah,
interesting figure.
yeah,
I would have guessed it would be pretty high, but that's a remarkably high figure.
yeah,
And I totally agree with your analysis. A good news, bad. Do we say bad news? A good news caution. How about that
right,
way? Good
right,
news, caution side. So the good news is, that I think that people do want to have this information. Now, you know this. You've probably seen the data. Do they really read it? Do they really act on it? Is another question.
right,
And I get really upset about health halos, which is what you're touching on. And we're seeing more and more health halos. We know health halos have a real impact. So I know your listeners know what I mean when I say health halos, but by that I mean these catchphrases that are used that are supposed to be a proxy for goodness. And in fact, in my forthcoming book, I have a whole section on this.
oh,
This,
awesome,
it's the goodness illusion, right? So gluten free, non GMO, healthy, right? Chemical free, all these kinds, toxin free, locally grown. Like there are a lot of really interesting health halos that people just they don't really dig into them. They assume that they're evidence based and they assume that they're virtuous. When in fact, just scratching the surface a little bit, that the goodness illusion sort of dissipates
right,
on all the ones I've just talked about. So I do find it frustrating, and I think that those health halos play to that chaotic information environment that we were talking about before. People want a shortcut to goodness, right? They want a shortcut to decision making, and we can't really blame them, right? Because they're busy and it's so noisy out there that seeing that label, even the color green, as you know,
yeah,
can be a health halo. But all of those, like locally grown, is a really interesting one. It's and I talk about it in my forthcoming book because I'm kind of attracted to that idea. We go to a farmer's market
mhm,
every by we I mean my beautiful wife goes to a farmer's market every single weekend because we're kind of attracted, but it's actually very complicated, right? It is really
yeah,
complicated. Is buying locally really better for the environment? You know what? You look at the evidence, it's messy. Is locally grown, even does it even taste better? You do blind taste. You know what? It's really messy. So I think we need to be careful not to be pulled into that goodness illusion because it can actually short circuit the goal that we're actually trying to achieve.
So how does it work on the fear side then? Again, in your book,
Yeah,
you
great
talk
question.
a little bit about the fear associated with different decisions, and your book does a good job chronologically going through some of those steps that you take in a day, and how you kind of determine whether or not you're gonna pick up your phone for a little while longer, or eat that, or do this or that or the other. But what we're finding is there's a lot of fear around certain types of food, right? And I'll use the example of GMOs. And Jimmy Kimmel had this great kind of segment on one of his shows
I remember
talking
it. I
to,
remember it.
yeah, it's absolutely hilarious, where he says, we're going to we go to the local farmers market, and just say, okay, do you consume GMOs? And everybody's, oh, no way, no way, and heck, I'm not going to do that. That's bad. That's bad. Well, what's a GMO? Well, nobody knew, right? So there was that inherent view that something is bad without realizing what it even is, right?
That's so true, so true, and that is a hilarious bit. But it really highlights the power of that label, right? It's become non-GMO, right? Has become a truism as it's better for you, it's healthier,
Right. Yeah.
and you probably know this. The topic of GMO is actually the topic where there is the biggest disconnect between experts and the public, more so than vaccines, more so than climate change. The public, depending on what study that you look at, and you probably are really close to this data too,
Yeah.
but somewhere between 40 and 50% of the public has a degree of hesitancy about GMOs, which is really remarkable when you in the context of health, by the way. I'm not talking about
Yeah.
environment or corporate ownership, we're talking about health. When you think about the almost complete scientific consensus that they're safe from a health perspective, right? But non-GMO has become this health halo where it's supposed to signify better for you, healthier. And it is interesting because you have this almost market cascade that's happened now. The market has just given up, right? And now you have, Triscuits, which I love Triscuits. Can I say Triscuits? I'm not sponsored by
No,
Triscuits.
it's totally fine. We're not sponsored, so it's completely whatever you want to
I
say.
I love Triscuits. I've eaten my whole, and now they're non-GMO. And so I actually tried to move away from eating them, but my love of Triscuits went over, and I keep eating them. But that is totally marketing. You know that the people that are making Triscuits know that they're, from a health perspective, there is no benefit. They've just sort of given in to the power
Yeah.
of the non-GMO market. And we also know that if something is scarier, placed or a negativity bias, more likely to have an impact, more likely to remember it, more likely to act on it. And so many of these things play to the negativity bias, right? Are we ever going to break the non-GMO myth? I don't know, right? It's fascinating. There is some evidence, that the concern has gone down in some jurisdictions, but despite that, I think that people just feel like there's nothing to lose. Let's keep pushing this myth, and we're going to market to it. But it is a really frustrating trend. The chemophobia thing is also
Oh
I'm
yeah.
fascinated with the degree of people who don't want chemicals in their life. I don't know, where they're going to live. I often joke. You may have heard me say this before. They want to live on the lip of a black hole, right? Where
Yeah. There's
matter
nothing.
is being pulled asunder. Are chemicals there? I don't know. Maybe there's no chemicals there.
It truly is. And I think Dr. Joe Schwartz from Quebec actually talks a little bit about that too. With when you go through it, I think he has an apple and all the different chemical
Right,
compounds that
right.
you're consuming. Yet people want to say a clean label with no chemicals. Well, it's kind of what comprises.
Well, we have this whole clean beauty movement that's based on the same
Yeah.
thing, and it's a huge movement. And that's another health halo now, right? Clean beauty.
Right.
But look, and people will say, Tim, well, you're being too glib. People, when you say chemicals, what they really mean is they don't want harmful synthetic chemicals. That's what they mean when they say that. But the fact of the matter that the word chemical has been transformed is the point, right? That's the
Yeah.
point. That it now has taken on this other meaning that is completely disconnected from the evidence, and it's just about fear mongering.
So we talked about the GMOs and the new technologies coming forward around gene editing, right? So even more precise science around that. So do you feel like it almost sounds better, right? Gene editing versus genetic modification. But I'm not too sure. What's kind of your initial take on things like that?
Oh, great question. Great question. I've been obviously following this really closely, and you get this sense from the biotech community and from the agricultural community that not everyone, but I've heard some people say, "Oh, it's going to be better. People are going to be more
Yeah,
accepting of it." I don't think so. Maybe I'm becoming old and cynical. They're just going to see it as GMO. They're not going to make this nuanced differentiation between gene edited plants and the old school GMO plants. I think they're just going to see it as the same. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this is an invitation. Maybe what we should do. Let's be positive. Okay, let's be positive. And maybe this is an opportunity to re-engage this conversation and say, look,
yeah,
this is what's really happening. Maybe that's what we should do. But I'm this debate has been going on for so long, and that non-GMO rhetoric in general has won the day, and so I'm a little bit pessimistic.
yeah. So if you would have any advice to our listeners on how to overcome some of these the negativities and the fears and all these, what would it be?
Okay, so look, even though I just said, "Oh, I'm I'm so pessimistic about non-GMOs," we do have evidence that talking about the science makes a difference.
Mhm.
And I know it doesn't. It feels like, what are you talking about? It makes no difference. It does make a difference, and I think we should think of it almost like a public health intervention, where you making a little change really does matter, right? So,
Yeah,
look, you're not going to change the mind of that individual right in front of you, but if you keep talking about the science, you really can make a difference. Um, the other thing I think is really important is teaching critical thinking skills. There have been studies that have shown that, and teaching them early, right? You teach those critical thinking skills, people are less likely to believe misinformation. They've actually done this in the context of GMOs, by the way. I don't know if you've seen this research.
mm,
Again,
yeah, I
hard
think
to
so.
study it well, but if people come at it from a more science informed perspective, they're less likely to believe that fear mongering around something like GMOs. So absolutely. So, talk about the science, um, critical thinking, and debunking. It does make a difference. I, I a topic like GMOs has just become so embedded culturally that it's more challenging. But new ones are emerging, right? And when you
Yeah,
see those new ones emerge, get on it quickly, right? Get on it quickly, even if it seems absurd. It's important to debunk it and to talk about the
right
science.
away.
And there's evidence that's shown that works. I think early days in GMOs, maybe we didn't do a good enough job debunking the myths around it. And the other thing that happens often is this conflation between a health concern, an environmental concern, and the corporate ownership concern. Right? They're often all lumped together, and the general public sees that only as a health concern. Right? And
Yeah,
so I think that's the other thing, sort of separate them. And by the way, the science is uncertain throughout. I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying that they're clear about environment and corporate ownership, but separate the concerns and debunk
yeah.
them clearly.
So we do a lot of farm tours on my own farm and with farm and food care. But one of the questions that usually comes out is, why do these companies make you grow their seeds? And as a farmer, I'm always taken a little aback when I say, nobody makes me grow these seeds. I have so many different choices in my Rolodex of different, whether it's different commodities, and even within those commodities, I have tons of different varieties and different companies to buy from. But I think you're right. There's that viewpoint that company X is making us grow this and you don't have a choice. But it's nothing further from the truth, right?
Yeah, you're right about that, and there's this belief that GMOs benefits these big farms, right? That they're the ones that are getting the greatest benefit, and small farmers don't want to use them, which again isn't
Yeah,
true either. And
yeah,
even that little differentiation, I think, would make a difference for some people in the public who want to support the smaller farmers. Maybe they want to support the family farm that's local to them, and uh, they don't really understand the economics of the GMOs and the benefits to even small farmers
Yeah.
of GMOs. So even that kind of education, I think, makes a difference. And the other thing is, people like hearing. You know this. People like hearing from farmers. I always talk about this when I
Yeah.
present. The imagery is fantastic. People trust farmers and they want to support them.
Yeah. One last question that I have. Uh, like I said, growing up, we trusted so many people from um, the trust for law enforcement to doctors to teachers and all the way through to where we have just this wavering level of trust. Is it why? Why did we do why in general did we move this direction? It just seems so odd.
And the other thing that's odd is if you look at where trust is broken down, it often seems arbitrary. Like, why aren't you trusting, this community anymore, but you do trust the other community? Well, part of look, it's obviously complex, but part of what's going on is there are actors out there that benefit from creating distrust, right? It happens in the political realm, right? So
Yeah.
they want to create distrust of these institutions because they're going to benefit from the creation of distrust. And social media has made it easier to do that, right? Where you can create an echo chamber that benefits from distrust. The other thing that I think is often underplayed, doesn't get enough attention, is often those spreading misinformation about GMOs, about let's say, fluoride, about vaccines. I could go down the list. Their goal is to create distrust. Like I often like you're hearing it a lot right now. Right now, well, we don't trust the information about that. We don't trust the actors. We don't trust the institutions. That's why we believe this stuff. But we have to remember misinformation is being spread to create distrust
Yeah.
of those institutions, which allows more misinformation to be spread. And then the cycle starts to accelerate. More misinformation means more distrust, which means more misinformation. And around that cycle goes. So part of the growth of distrust is because there's so much misinformation out there inviting the public to distrust. And let's not forget that there are often reasons to distrust, right? There have been bad actors in
Right.
the government, in public health, in the agricultural community, and those stories of bad actors are weaponized to create this idea that we should distrust everyone all the time. I could go on, but I'll stop there. That's a dark way to end.
I think we could make 2 or 3 episodes out of this, but I think we'll have to call it quits here. And I do want to thank you for taking the time to be with us on the podcast today, Timothy. This has been excellent. Um, we have a lot of conversations taking place in the agriculture community and in the food community about food, and it's always great to have an expert like yourself kind of shed some light on some of the different situations. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks to the entire agricultural community for everything that you guys do.
I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to our Ask a Farmer podcast. We at Canadian Food Focus value the input from our listeners and ask that you share this podcast with your friends and family. Remember, this is a two-way street, so we seek your input for future segments that are of interest to you about food and farming. To do this, please click on the Ask Us icon at the top of our website, canadianfoodfocus.org. While you're there, feel free to follow our numerous social media links and sign up for our newsletter. This segment was produced and edited by Angela Larson, research and writing by Dorothy Long and Penny Eaton, music by Andy Elson. I'm your host, Clinton Monchuk, and from all of us here at Canadian Food Focus, we wish you good health and great eats.